It was a quiet Saturday morning in Waterford Island. Then, at just before 10 in the morning, an emergency call reached Island's ambulance service. A man sounded frightened. He told the operator that his partner wasn't breathing. He said she still had a heartbeat. He said she had fallen several times the night before after they had been drinking. He told the operator that she had also fallen down the stairs. Within minutes, paramedics rushed toward the house on O'Brien Street. Inside, they found 47-year-old Gillian Curran. Despite desperate effort to save her life, Gillian was pronounced dead at the scene. At first, it sounded like a tragic accident, but before the day was over, investigators had begun asking a completely different question. What if Gillian hadn't died from a series of falls? What if someone inside the house already knew exactly how she had been injured? Today, that question is at the center of one of Ireland's newest murder trial. The prosecution say Gillian died after a violent assault. The defense says her injuries were the result of accidental falls. The truth now rests with the jury. And as the trial unfolds, every emergency call, every injury, and every minute inside that house is being examined in extraordinary detail. Before we continue, it's important to remember that Marcus O'Neill has pleaded not guilty to murder. The trial is ongoing, and under the law, he is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Thoughtful, this documentary will separate established facts from allegations presented during the trial. Gillian was from Tramore in County Waterford. Friends and family knew her as someone who had faced difficult struggles through her life. During the trial, prosecutor told the jury that Gillian had battled alcohol addiction for many years. Despite those challenges, she remained close to people who cared about her. She was 47-year-old. Marcus O'Neill was living on O'Brien Street in Waterford City. According to the prosecution, the two were in a relationship. Gillian did not permanently live at his house, but prosecutors said she stayed there from time to time, including the night before her death. No one outside that house knew that it would become the focus of one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Ireland this year. According to evidence outlined to the jury, Gillian spent the evening of January 24 at the house. What happened during the hours that follow is now the central issue in court. There are no independent witnesses who have publicly described exactly what happened inside the home. Instead, the investigators have relied on physical evidence, medical examinations, emergency responders, forensic investigators, and Marcus O'Neill's own statements to reconstruct those final hours. When emergency services finally arrived the following morning, Gillian could not be saved. Her death immediately triggered the major guard investigation. A senior investigating officer was appointed. An incident room was established at Waterford Guard Station. Officers applied for witness and for anyone with camera or dashcam footage from the area around O'Brien Street to come forward as they worked to piece together the events leading to Gillian's death. Only hours after Gillian was found, Marcus O'Neill voluntarily attended Waterford Guard Station for questioning. Later that day, he was formally arrested on suspicion of murder. Days later, he appeared before court charged with Gillian Curran's murder. He denied the charge. More than a year later, that case has finally reached a jury, where prosecutors and defense lawyers are presenting two completely different explanations for how Gillian suffered the injuries that ended her life. One says it was a terrible accident, the other says it was a murder. And before the jury hears from medical experts, forensic specialists, and investigators, they first listen to something that captured the final moments before police arrived. A recording, the 999 call that started everything. As the jury settled into the courtroom, they were taken back to to the morning of January 25th, 2025. Not through photographs, not through witness statements, but through the voice of the man now standing trial. The prosecution played the emergency call made from the house on O'Brien Street. It was one of the first pieces of evidence that jury heard. In the recording, Marcus O'Neill told the ambulance dispatcher that Gillian Curran was unconscious. He said she was not breathing. He believed she still had a heartbeat. The dispatcher immediately began asking questions while help sent to the address. As the conversation continued, O'Neill tried to explain what had happened. According to the recording played in court, he said Gillian had suffered several falls during the previous night. He said they had both been drinking alcohol. He described one fall in the kitchen, another in the hallway. He also claimed she had fallen down the stairs. His explanation was simple. He believed those falls had caused her injuries. The dispatcher focused on one thing: keeping Gillian alive. O'Neill was instructed to begin CPR while paramedics rushed to the house. Every second mattered. For the emergency crew, they had no way of knowing whether they were responding to a medical emergency, a serious accident, or something much more disturbing. When paramedics arrived, they immediately took over. They found Gillian lying inside the property. Despite their effort, they could not save her. She was pronounced dead at the scene. But what happened next would completely change the direction of the investigation. Several emergency workers later told the jury that O'Neill repeated the same explanation he had given during the emergency call. He said Gillian had fallen multiple times after drinking. According to their evidence, he consistently described the injury as the result of accidents rather than an assault. At first glance, that explanation could sound believable. People do fall. Alcohol can affect balance. Serious injuries can happen after accidents or falls. But investigators had the responsibility to examine every possibility. Whenever a death appears unexplained or suspicious, courts must determine whether the injuries match the account given by the people who were present. That process began almost immediately. The house on O'Brien Street was sealed off. Crime scene investigators arrived. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. Every room, every surface, and every possible clue would become part of the investigation. Meanwhile, Gillian's body was taken for a post-mortem examination. The finding from that examination would later become one of the most important parts of the prosecution's case, because according to prosecutor, the medical evidence does not support the explanation of multiple accidents or falls. That disagreement lies at the very heart of this trial. The prosecution said the injuries tell one story. The defense says they tell another. Neither side dispute that Gillian died inside the house. The dispute is over how she suffered those injuries. And as the jury would soon learn, the doctors who examined Gillian reached conclusions that prosecutors believe are impossible to ignore. Those medical findings would become some of the most powerful evidence presented during the trial. For investigators, the most important question was no longer when Gillian Curran died. It was how she died. Only a detailed post-mortem examination could answer that question. After Gillian's death, her body was examined by a forensic pathologist. The finding from that examination would later become one of the prosecution's strongest pieces of evidence. And according to the state, those findings tells a very different story from the one described during the 999 call. Though the trial prosecutors have argued that Gillian's injury was not consistent with someone simply falling several times after drinking, instead they say medical evidence points to a violent assault. That is the central claim the jury must now consider. The prosecution's case depends heavily on whether the medical evidence supports that conclusion. The defense, however, rejects that interpretation. Marcus O'Neill had pleaded not guilty, and his legal team disputed the prosecution's account of how those injuries occurred. The jury will ultimately decide which interpretation of the evidence they accept. Medical evidence is often the most powerful witness in a murder trial. Unlike eyewitnesses, it cannot forget details. It cannot be influenced by emotion. Instead, doctors examine injuries, study the body, and compare those findings with the explanation given by investigators and witnesses. If the injuries match the explanation, that explanation becomes more believable. If they do not, investigator begins asking much harder question. That is exactly what happened in this case. According to the prosecutions, the injuries documented during Gillian's postmortem examination do not fit the account that she simply suffered a series of accident falls. That disagreement is now one of the biggest issues before the jury. The prosecution also reminded juror that no witness actually saw what happened inside the house during Gillian's final hours. That means the case is built from many different pieces. Emergency call, medical evidence, forensic examination, statements made after Gillian was found, and the timeline is established by investigators. Each piece on its own may not answer every question, but prosecutors say that when those pieces are placed together, they reveal what really happened inside the house. The defense strongly disagree. Though the trial, Marcus O'Neill legal teams has maintained his plea of not guilty, their position is that the prosecution has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Gillian's death was the result of a murder. As with every criminal trial, the burden of proof remains entirely within the prosecution. Marcus O'Neill does not have to prove his innocence. Instead, prosecutors must convince the jury of his guilt beyond reasonable doubt before any conviction can be returned. That legal principle remains in place until the trial reaches its conclusion. The court has also heard that the defense obtained its own expert pathologists to review the medical evidence before the trial began. That is common in serious criminal cases where expert medical opinion is expected to play a major role. It means the jury will hear competing interpretation before reaching its own conclusion. As the trial continued, prosecutors moved away from the medical findings alone. They turned the jury attention back to the house on O'Brien Street because they believe what investigators found inside the property raises even more questions about what happened before the emergency call was made. Those questions would soon become another major focus of the trial. As the prosecution continued presenting its case, the focus shifted from Gillian Curran's injury to the place where she spent her final hours, the house on O'Brien Street. For investigators, it wasn't just the location where Gillian was found. It was a place that could answer one critical question. Did the physical evidence inside the house match the explanation Marcus O'Neill had given? According to the prosecution, the answer is no. They told the jury that the evidence collected from the property, together with the medical finding and the witness testimony, points toward a violent assault rather than a series of accidental falls. The defense completely rejected that conclusion. Marcus O'Neill had pleaded not guilty, and the jury alone must decide whether the prosecution has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. During the trial, jurors heard from members of the emergency services who were among the first responder and people to enter the house that morning. Their role was not to investigate a crime. Their first priority was to save Gillian's life. But as they described the scene they encountered, their observation became part of the evidence the jury must now consider. Paramedics told the court that Marcus O'Neill remained consistent in his explanation. He said Gillian had fallen several times during the previous night. He repeated that they had both been drinking. He described different falls around the house, including one involving the stairs. Those statements were made before investigators had completed their forensic examination, making them an important part of the timeline presented during the trial. After Gillian was pronounced dead, the scene changed completely. The house became the center of a homicide investigation. Guards, forensic officers documented every room. Photographs were taken, potential evidence was collected, nothing inside the property was considered too small to examine. Investigators knew that physical evidence can either support a witness account or completely contradict it. In cases with no independent eyewitnesses, forensic science often becomes one of the strongest voices in the courtroom. That is why prosecutors have spent so much time connecting the medical evidence with what investigators found at the scene. They argue that these pieces fit together. The defense says they do not. As the trial has shown, this case is not built around one dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, prosecutors are asking the jury to look at the entire picture: the emergency call, the injuries, the statements made afterward, the forensic examination, and the medical opinion. Their argument is that when viewed together, those pieces point to one conclusion. The defense argues that the prosecution is drawing conclusions that have not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. That disagreement lies at the heart of Irish trial. One of the prosecution's final tasks is to persuade the jury that Marcus O'Neill's explanation simply does not fit the evidence. The defense, meanwhile, is preparing to challenge every important part of that argument. And when the defense begins presenting its case, juror will hear why Marcus O'Neill says he's not guilty of murdering Gillian Curran. By this stage of the trial, the jury had heard days of evidence from emergency responders, investigators, and medical experts. The prosecution had presented its theory. Now the defense faced the challenge of raising reasonable doubts. From the very beginning of the case, Marcus O'Neill has denied murdering Gillian Curran. He has entered the plea of not guilty, and under Irish law, he remains presumed innocent unless the prosecution proves its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The legal principle is one of the foundation of every criminal trial. The defense does not have to prove exactly how Gillian died. Instead, its role to challenge the prosecution evidence and show that the state has not removed every reasonable doubt. Though the trial, Marcus O'Neill's account has remained broadly consistent. According to evidence heard by the jury, he said that he and Gillian had been drinking alcohol together on the night before her death. He maintained that she suffered several accidental falls, including a fall on the stairs. He repeated that explanation during the emergency call and again to the paramedics who arrived at the house. The defense argued that consistency mattered. Rather than changing his story as the investigation progressed, O'Neill continued to describe the events in the same general way. Whether that account is accurate is now for the jury to decide. Another important part of the defense strategy has been the issue of independent expert evidence. Before the trial, the defense instructed its own forensic pathologist to examine the medical finding in the case. That expert reviewed the post-mortem evidence independently of the prosecution. This is common practice in serious murder trial, practically when medical evidence is expected to play a central role. It allows both sides to present expert opinion, giving the jury the opportunity to hear competing interpretations before reaching a verdict. Defense has also reminded jurors that there were no independent eyewitnesses inside the house during Gillian's final hours. No security camera recorded what happened. No neighbor witnessed the event inside the property. As a result, the case depends largely on a forensic evidence, medical opinion, and the conclusion the jury draws from those facts. That does not make the prosecution case weak, but it does mean the juror must carefully examine every piece of evidence rather than relying on assumptions. During cross-examination, defense lawyer questioned witness about timeline, injuries, and the conclusion investigator reached. That is a normal part of any criminal trial. Their objective is to tell